At its heart, law is a service industry. And I think what we've done a really good job of is showing our clients or convincing them that we'll put them ahead of anything else. And so, our job is to serve their needs at the expense of our own. And what I hear from the younger generation is they're just not prepared to do that.
That is a very defining characteristic of the younger generation. Me being a part of that is that you want to have it all.
I mean, my business plan that I submitted to the Law Society, which understandably they rejected, effectively said, get good lawyers, get good clients, do great work, be happy. And they rejected it and said, that's not a business plan. And I sent it back to them and said, genuinely, that is my business plan.
Today's episode is sponsored by VXT, the phone system built for law firms. VXT integrates with practice management systems so that when lawyers make calls, their billable time and legal advice can be saved in the right place automatically. 20% of billable time goes unrecorded. A lot of that is phone calls that get forgotten about. Get some of those billables back using VXT. Go to vxt.co.nz or click the link in the description to find out more.
Welcome to the File Notes podcast. Today's guest is Helen MacKay, a leader in New Zealand's legal profession, starting her career as a 12-year-old filing documents in her dad's law firm as a fourth-generation lawyer in her family, to working for global giants like Nestlé in London. She's a former General Counsel who led IPOs and navigated the demands of juggling a high-powered legal career with motherhood. Now, as the founder and leader of Juno Legal, she's redefining what it means to practice law on your terms. So, welcome to the podcast, Helen. I'm going to start at the start of your career, and that's not when you were filing documents at your dad's law firm when you were 12 years old, but when you started your in-house career at the Electricity Corporation in New Zealand. That's quite a different route from going private practice, like most people do when they first start out in law. What led you down that path?
What led me down that path? Thanks, Sophie, and thanks for having me here. Look, the reality is it wasn't an option for me. So even though I was at the time the Rudd Watson Stone witness examination champion, I couldn't get an internship with them. I couldn't get one with any of the big firms. And I really didn't want to move back to live in to work for my father. And so I was offered a graduate role at Electricity Corporation. And, this is 20 plus years ago. No one really thought about in-house as a career or as an option. Everyone was very much focused on getting into a law firm. And there's some really good reasons to start out in law firms, even if you want to eventually go in-house. But as I said, for me, it was the option on the table. And I really quickly found that I loved it. Even after only about 6 months, I was jumping in, leading projects, flying around the country, selling small power stations, and effectively never looked back. And
so what were the kind of projects or legal issues that you were working on there, like the more nitty-gritty of your day-to-day?
So effectively, I started out very much as a property lawyer. And so at the time, Electricity Corporation was getting rid of its very small hydroelectric power stations. And a lot of them hadn't really been properly documented, or there needed to be easements created over farmers' land. I learned heaps about electricity, about water, spent a lot of time in really beautiful parts of the country, thinking of Lake Coleridge down in Canterbury and Cobb, which is sort of near Nelson or near Takaka, the Cobb Valley. So really, really amazing way of getting to see kind of the practical application of law, not just what's in a document, but going out and actually talking to landowners and talking to farmers and saying, okay, what do you need to achieve your outcome? And what did the company need to achieve theirs? Whole sales process. So it was a really amazing learning curve. And I had amazing support both from the team who was there, and I'm still in touch with some of them, and also for some great external lawyers that we worked with who kind of took me under their wing. Because I think going straight in-house, there's definitely a technical aspect that if you're not careful, you just won't develop. You're effectively sort of instantly in making commercial decisions or giving quite practical advice, but some of the technical skills around drafting, you may miss out on.
And that kind of boots on the ground experience you had around New Zealand, do you think that was because you were in an in-house role? Do you think you have that opportunity as a junior lawyer going straight into private practice?
From what I understand, no. A lot of my friends went into the big firms, and depending on which rotation they got or which department they ended up in, they might have spent 18 months, effectively doing discovery and litigation. And sometimes it was quite a long time before they even got in front of a client, let alone the kind of client stakeholders, which is what I was getting to do. So looking back, I was incredibly fortunate. I think as well, because I had a law and business degree, that was always probably the direction I would end up going in. And so, it was a really good grounding for me and really exposed me to the different parts of business. That said, when I was first in law school, I thought I was going to be a criminal lawyer, which turned out to be way too gritty for me. And I think I was probably a bit too idealistic about what it actually entailed, and a summer clerkship doing that really quickly made me understand it wasn't going to be right for me.
After your time in New Zealand, like most Kiwis, you spent some time in London. Outside of the work there, because that's also really interesting, what was it like being a Kiwi in London during that time?
Yeah, I loved it. We had some great travels on the way there. Arrived in London as it was kind of coming out of spring. So it was fantastic. And lots of young Kiwis there. So met some really great friends who are still great friends today. On the work front, I think I spent a month filing papers in a bank and had a few interviews, including a couple of interviews with some of the big law firms there, and realised quite quickly I didn't want to go into a law firm. I really wanted to stay in-house. And I think that's where my skills were best suited. So had some fantastic time and got to travel quite a lot, both with work and just for fun.
And so you worked for two companies in-house when you were there. One of them was Nestle. Can you tell me some of the legal projects that you were working on when you were there?
Absolutely. The one that I remember the most was a competition law study into ice cream on a stick, effectively. Nestle is well known for a variety of consumer goods, and the study that I worked on at the time was about ice cream and about how the allocation of freezer space worked. So a little bit, like a lot of retailers, the supplier actually provides the freezer that the ice cream or the cold drink or whatever it is stays in. And then whether or not a competitor can use that or not, it becomes pretty interesting.
Yeah, it seems like because it's such a big global powerhouse, there'd be a lot of very niche issues that you might not get to work on if you were in New Zealand. How big was the legal team that you were in?
From memory, I think it was about 14 lawyers, which, at the time is actually still a relatively small legal team for a company that size. But they are a Swiss headquartered company, so they also had a large team in Switzerland and a large team in the States. So it was my first exposure to a global legal team. And I think I've seen a lot more of it since then. But the way that people collaborate now means it really doesn't matter where in the world parts of your legal team are based, you can make it work.
And what does the kind of structure look like in a legal team like that, say the 14 of you?
So from recollection, I think we still had a General Counsel who was very much upwards focused, so kind of looking after the other senior leaders and the board. And then there was a head of legal whose role was to look after the lawyers who reported into them. And I think there were about 12 of us. I think there was a couple of, I'm going back in time a little bit, I think there was a sort of competition and regulation team and some teams who were doing more sort of property or commercial arrangements, and then one or two litigators. And that's relatively common.
Interesting. And when we previously spoke, you mentioned a £1 shop that they had.
Such a good shop. It was their staff shop, and Nestle at the time used to distribute a whole lot of other retailers' products through their distribution channels. And so you could effectively buy anything there from, L'Oreal products to Pisbuin and everything was £1. So as you can imagine, I took quite a lot home But yeah, it was a great way of getting staff to use and champion a product while still, making a small profit.
I wonder if they still have that and if it's still £1.
I wonder.
And so your other role that you held when you were in the UK was at Novartis. Can you tell me about the legal work that you were doing in that role?
Sure. So Novartis is quite a large Swiss pharmaceutical company. I knew nothing about them when I joined, but it was a great team, and the General Counsel at the time, Sally, became a real mentor for me, which was fantastic. And essentially, all of the licensing and distribution stuff that you can imagine a pharmaceutical company needs to be involved in. We also had an animal health division, so I learned lots of interesting stuff about animal health as well as human health. I think the great thing about being in-house is you learn so much about the business that you're embedded in, and how does it work in terms of product or customer? How do they create a market? How do they sell into that market? And I think I've always enjoyed that.
And so when you actually came back from London, you were faced with the decision to go to either Balgully, an offer to go back into private practice, or to Vector, which was in-house. Did you have any temptation to go down the Balgully route when you were faced with that?
Look, I did. It would have been my first time going into a law firm, and there was a real temptation, I guess, to see what that other side looked like and probably polish up some of my skills that were no doubt lacking. The reality was I just, when I thought about it and, really thought about it hard, I just didn't think that was going to be the right avenue for me. It didn't help that the in-house role actually paid slightly more, or it didn't hurt. But I think the reality was I was, by then, through and through, even after only 4 years, I was an in-house lawyer, and I really wanted to stay in that zone. And then, ironically, of course, because New Zealand's so small, I ended up, as the Vector lawyer, instructing the partner that I would have had if I had gone in, because I would have been going into his team. So I actually got to work with him really closely and work with the person who ended up going into the role. Still managed to learn quite a lot, but was very much happy in-house.
And how did you find that transition coming back to New Zealand and working in-house New Zealand? I know you've mentioned before that the in-house profession in the UK is much older and far more established. So did you find any differences coming back, or?
Just trying to think if there was anything that stood out to me. I don't think so. I probably would say in the UK, the legal team was sort of very, very focused on the legal issues and probably a little bit more narrowly targeted. In New Zealand, in my experience, the team tend to have a bit more of a broader remit. Our corporates tend to be smaller, and so lawyers inside companies are probably leaned on to have a bit more input in areas that aren't strictly legal.
Mm-hmm. And moving on to your next role, taking through a journey of your career so fast, is that you became General Counsel at a company and you led them through an IPO as well. Can you share what your responsibilities were stepping up into that General Counsel role and how that differed from being an in-house lawyer more generally?
Sure. So it was effectively establishing a greenfields function, which means it was a company that had never had an in-house legal function before. And, we actually do that quite often now at Juno. And what you tend to find, particularly in quite mature companies, is they've got the day-to-day issues that need to be dealt with, but there's also a whole lot of process and procedure that perhaps has never actually been addressed. Because if you think about how companies use lawyers externally, they wait until there's a contract or something in front of them or an issue, and then they instruct that out. But what it means is if no one's actually raised an issue or, lifted that rock and looked under it, that potentially sits there. And the job of an in-house lawyer, particularly at General Counsel level, is to come in and kind of run that risk radar and say, actually, across all of these areas, how is this business performing in terms of managing legal risk? So in the fact that when I stepped into it, they were also about to go into an IPO. It took quite a long time. It meant that it really was drinking from a fire hose. there was so much to do on the day-to-day stuff that I didn't really get a good chance for quite a long time to look at some of the more foundational pieces and how well the company was positioned.
You mentioned the IPO. That would have been quite a learning experience. What kind of were the main things that you had to do as part of that process, and maybe the main learnings as well from it?
Yeah, I mean, we had extremely good external counsel, so it wasn't so much dealing with the technical part of the offer document or how it was going to be structured. It was very much a project management piece of making sure that all the different parts were coming together.
You were raising your young family when you were also in this role. What was it like being a mum and then also being a general counsel, two very demanding roles at the same time? I imagine that would be pushing and pulling a lot. How did you manage that?
Yeah, not particularly well on reflection. I think, I wanted to do a good job at both, but, there is a natural tension there. And I think at the time I thought that I could make it all work. And, hopefully I did to an extent. But I think the realization for me is that some of those roles are big roles, and doing them, on a flexible basis or a part-time basis, isn't always possible unless you've either got an incredibly supportive team behind you, or you've kind of, perhaps co-sharing a role or job sharing a role. But trying to do a really big role on your own on a part-time basis was tricky. Thankfully, I managed to recruit quite quickly. So I had someone coming in as a more junior legal counsel, and then someone coming in to manage our public affairs or investor relations, which I'd also been doing to date. But yeah, I don't think I'd recommend it for any other young parents that I know.
And looking back, is there anything that you think you did that worked really well in terms of trying to balance that before you did decide to step away from that role?
Probably I managed 60% of the time to keep to that 4 days per week. So actually have one day, and I always made it a Wednesday, so it kind of broke up the week. It wasn't perfect. And it was kind of before the days that working from home is so commonplace now. It wasn't back then. And, you certainly didn't have a laptop you could just take back and forwards from home or work. So I was off on the phone on a Wednesday, but I, usually could manage it and not get called back into the office, which I think just gave me some breathing space.
Yeah. And I know that you're passionate about keeping talented women in the profession, both in private practice and in-house. What do you think that private practice law firms could change to help retain senior women in legal better?
Yeah, it's a great question, Sophie. I don't think it's as gendered as it used to be, though. I think, I see a lot of really talented young male lawyers grappling exactly with the same issues that our younger female lawyers grapple with, or that I grappled with. I think, at its heart, law is a service industry. And so we're all dictated to a certain extent by what do our clients want and need from us. And I think what we've done a really good job of is showing our clients or convincing them that we'll put them ahead of anything else. And so, our job is to serve their needs at the expense of our own. And what I hear from the younger generation is they're just not prepared to do that. There has to be much more of a dialogue between the client and the lawyer, hopefully backed up by the law firm, that says, we really want to do a great job for you, but we're not going to do it at the expense of our well-being or the expense of how we want to parent or how we want to be part of our community. I was talking with an external lawyer the other day who was saying to me they have a deal that hopefully is going to close on the 23rd or 24th of December with an international counterparty. But if it's not going to happen, their client has told them they have to come back the next day. Now that's Christmas Day. Nothing is actually that important. We're not, a lot of the time here, it's not about saving lives or doing a job that requires that level of urgency. But I think we've all convinced ourselves that it is important, that it has to get done, and we really try and kind of crunch that pressure. And the problem is, because lawyers are trying to get all of this work done, they're trying to support their client, they're trying to get to that outcome, they often end up in the firing line and having very little control over whether or not they're going to get dragged into work on Christmas Day. So, the younger lawyers I meet, they see the role models ahead of them, perhaps at their large firm, perhaps in-house, where, let's face it, a lot of senior lawyers work incredibly hard in-house. And younger lawyers are saying to me, I don't want that. That's not the life that I see for myself. I want flexibility. I want to be able to, possibly have it all, but, you're allowed to want what you want. And we've got lots of young lawyers who are doing really interesting stuff, maybe building tech startups on the side, or co-parenting, or doing community work. There's no end of why people want flexibility. And even people who want to work incredibly hard and be incredibly focused, I think they just want some more autonomy over their work style or when they turn up to work, rather than effectively being told that you are tied to this desk for 60, 70, 80 hours a week. But it's a real challenge. I think the law firms have made huge progress in this regard, but at the end of the day, they are still trying to serve a client need and balance what their people want. So it's tricky. It's really tricky.
I think that is a very defining characteristic of the younger generation. Me being a part of that is that you want to have it all. And I really like what you said before that as well, is that, and something I always like to remind myself of, is nobody's dying. If you're not making a deadline, it's actually not the end of the world. It will just pass in time and nothing has actually changed. So I think it's a really important thing for people to remember.
It is. And I think, some of the conversations that people have been having about wellbeing in the profession and mental health are incredibly important. It's fascinating to me. Obviously, I work with a lot of lawyers. I know a lot of lawyers. I think we're often our own almost hardest taskmaster. The number of lawyers I know who put themselves under immense pressure because that's actually the personality type that a lot of us, represent. We're perfectionists. A scientist in the US did a study into lawyers and what makes them tick. I think his name was Dr. Larry Richard, and he really looked at it and he found out that 78% of us, if you know your Myers-Briggs terminology, are ISTJ. That's introverted, sensing, thinking, judging, which means we find it really hard to accept failure, to accept anything less than perfection. We're ruthlessly self-critical, allergic to failure. We don't take feedback well. And obviously there's all generalizations. It's certainly not true for everyone, or even everyone who fits into that cohort. But I certainly think there are elements of it that often come through in the legal profession that, I think it's great that we're aware of it and make sure that to the extent we can, we're actually looking after our best interests primarily before we can look after anyone else. I mean, I know it's trite, but, the whole kind of put your own, oxygen mask on before you put someone else's on, has to be true in this scenario. And I do know lawyers who, tell me it's about the firm they work at and they just have to work this way. But digging down into it, it actually becomes clear they probably haven't held their ground or asked for extra flexibility or pushed back if those demands were unreasonable. And I think it is going to take all of us to do that to make a really significant change.
100%. And I am so fascinated by those Myers-Briggs tests. There's lots of different versions of them, but I've done them in quite a few of the workplaces I've been in. I'd definitely recommend firms or teams to do the same, because you can understand how people like to work, like to receive feedback. Moving from your general counsel role, you went to the Law Society, the in-house Law Society Association of New Zealand. I think that's correct, ILANZ.
Yeah, In-House Lawyers Association, that's right.
There we go. What were the gaps or opportunities you saw for in-house lawyers during your time there? I know that you were getting into the very nitty-gritty of the in-house legal profession.
So just before I stepped into that role, I'd been the president of ILANZ, which was fantastic. And, from probably 40 years before, there's this emerging discipline of in-house. It's obviously grown and grown and grown, But at the time, it was still very much, sort of not quite emerging, but, really evolving into what it's become now. I think back then, there'd probably be about 21, 22% of the profession were practicing in-house. It's now 30%. It's a massive part of our profession that hasn't always been as well understood. And so I just had my third child, and going back to the GC role, the General Counsel role, just wasn't an option. I was barely making it work with 2 children. I didn't see how I was going to make it work with 3 children. And the company really needed more. They required me to come back more than full-time hours. So, we needed to part ways. The great thing about going into the Law Society or into ILANZ, because they were sort of a separate section, is I dropped back to doing 20 hours a week, which, for some breathing space was fantastic with 3 fairly young children. And what it meant is that for the first time, really, ILANZ had a dedicated executive officer who was really trying to build back the revenue base, look after its members and work out what did they want, what sort of events did they want, what sort of member experience, work with sponsors, so really kind of run it like a business unit inside the Law Society with the resources that we had. And it was probably my first opportunity to kind of see, how would you build a business? How would you make sure that you're delivering a product or a service that your customers want? So I had a fantastic 7 years there. I really enjoyed it.
And that gets us to how you found Juno Legal. Can you tell me about the story of how that came about?
Sure. So as you can probably imagine, throughout that 7 years, I got really close to a number of General Counsel throughout New Zealand. So General Counsel being the chief lawyer inside an organisation, because I was trying to find out what did they want for them and their teams from their membership association. But what I heard from them is that in terms of legal services out in the market, remembering that in-house lawyers are one of the biggest purchasers of legal services because they purchase legal services from external firms, they were saying to me that the service offerings were too rigid, too constrained. What they really needed was access to fantastic people who were not graduates or younger lawyers coming out of law firms. They were people who understood the difference between being a great lawyer and a great in-house lawyer and could be really quickly deployed and could come in for a project or come in for a period of time. Our model or the legal profession in New Zealand does make that quite tricky. Lawyers can't be contractors in New Zealand. And so the way they've managed it internationally, in the UK, they probably led the way, and then in the US and in Australia, is law firms like Juno would set up and you'd have a team of lawyers who'd effectively be available to deploy kind of on a rapid basis. So I had one of the Australian law firms doing this reach out to me asking if I would establish something similar in New Zealand. When I did the research, it looked like an Australian law firm can't technically own a New Zealand law firm. In the meantime, that firm actually went off to Asia. They were more interested in playing there. And so I thought to myself, I wonder, as my time at ILANZ was sort of naturally coming to an end, my youngest child was 8, and it just gave me a bit more breathing space. I thought to myself, well, what if I did it? What if I went through the process of setting up a firm and seeing if I could attract some amazing people and seeing if I could attract some great clients? So for the first year, it was very much with that experimental mindset. I didn't have too many expectations on myself. I didn't kind of set myself too many targets. I mean, my business plan that I submitted to the Law Society, which, understandably they rejected, effectively said, get good lawyers, get good clients, do great work, be happy. And they rejected it and said, that's not a business plan. And I sent it back to them and said, genuinely, that is my business plan. That is what I intend to do. And after a year, I'll decide if it's going to work or not. The rest is history. It did work. And there were certainly lawyers out there looking for a different model of practice that really met their needs. And there were plenty of clients who really wanted to access the lawyers that we brought into the team.
And so how does it work practically, Juno Legal?
So effectively, we're a law firm like any other. The only difference is that instead of our lawyers working in our office, they're out quite often working in client offices. And for most of our lawyers, they've only got one client at a time. Occasionally, they'll be split between two, depending on how many hours they want to work for each client or how many hours the client wants. But effectively, they are a dedicated service to that client for a period of time. And that means because we've locked in that commitment and that capacity, we can offer rates in the market that are a quarter to a fifth of what most large law firms can offer someone of the same calibre at.
And so I'd like to now break down your business plan. And the first one was getting good people or getting good lawyers.
Mm-hmm.
How do you define what makes a good lawyer at Juno?
Yeah, it's a great question. We were just journey mapping our recruitment strategy this morning, so it's very much top of mind. Almost all of our people have come to us because they like what we're doing, they like the model, they've had some really good feedback from someone they know that it works for them, and so they approach us. We've never really gone out and advertised. That isn't to say that we wouldn't, we just haven't really had to yet. We go through a process of working with someone to figure out, is this a model that's going to suit them? Are they someone who one day could be thrown into a large public sector entity, and then 6 months later they might jump into a really nimble young startup where you need a very different approach, a really different appetite to risk. And our lawyers have to be able to calibrate really quickly between clients to figure out what are the key issues here. Where do I need to really focus? How do I add the most value? And, quite often people are bringing in a Juno lawyer because something might not be working, or, the team's under a bit of pressure. They need some extra resource, or, a project's just been stood up and everyone's scrambling. I think most of our clients find now that recruitment processes are so slow, long time to work through recruitment. If you've got the minister throwing something at you and it needs to be stood up in a week, or if you've got, something's happening in a private sector organisation, you can't wait 3 to 6 months to recruit someone. It's agile resourcing at its finest, where you need someone to start next week. I ask our clients quite often, ideally, when would you want the person to start? And the answer is always yesterday. So when I was doing Stepping Up, which is the requirement to open your own law firm, I was on the course with a fantastic lawyer who wasn't sure what he wanted to do. Anyway, he and I agreed that we would start working together. He jumped into a firm for a few months, but then rang me and said, no, I can't do this. I need to jump in and join you. At the same time, the head of Trade Me, I was talking to her, and she decided this model was going to work really well for her. And sort of really we started from there. There were sort of 2 or 3 of us to begin with, and very quickly, that was in April 2017, pretty quickly over the next 9 months, we probably grew a team of 6 or 7 lawyers, and then really just kept going from there. And now we've got about 33 lawyers in the team, and we've got 6 of us here at HQ who run the team.
That's amazing, a great accomplishment for what you have achieved. If you're thinking about the level of PQE that people have when they come to Juno Legal, where is that sitting at?
So our baseline is 10 years PQE. And it's interesting, we do sometimes get asked, could we provide someone more junior? Would we take on someone, or in a recruitment sense, would we take on someone who's only had 2 or 3 years of experience, or someone who's never practiced in-house? And, the reality is we've made some pretty firm decisions around that. That is not the service that we offer. Our clients have huge trust in us that our lawyers are going to be able to come in and contribute at a really high level into the organisation. And the reality is I don't think it would be appropriate for us to send someone in who was incredibly junior, still needed that level of training and supervision that all young lawyers should get. But really the way our model works is they need to be comfortable in knowing what they know and knowing what they don't know, and where they might need some additional peer support, where they might need to talk to the General Counsel about how they might get that expertise. And our most senior lawyers know they don't know it all, and they're not expected to, but that takes some real judgment and what we call uncommon sense, which is what we're looking for. And, we've got a really rigorous recruitment sort of process. We do 5 reference checks, and we're really probing for how does that person show up under pressure. If things aren't clear, are they good at being proactive and having instructions clarified, and are they commercially astute, have they got good financial acumen, are they adaptable, and at the end of the day, are they a good person to work alongside who's got a sense of humour and keeps calm and diplomatic under pressure? Because if they're not, they could be a fantastic lawyer, and so often they are, but they're not the right lawyer for us.
And so this is on a slight tangent now, but still slightly related. You mentioned that 30% of lawyers are in-house now in New Zealand, with that number having increased a lot, but having been at law school recently, you never see in-house as an option displayed as a graduate program, or just that it's an option. You think that you have to go to private practice first. How do you think that lack of awareness can be addressed?
I think the firms have got, they've put a lot of focus and effort into their recruitment strategies, and, hats off to them for doing that. I think the only downside of it is it's created a view out there amongst most of the law students and graduates that I speak to, that getting an internship or a graduate role in a law firm is kind of the pinnacle. And if you don't get that, somehow you haven't kind of won your golden ticket. You're not as successful. And the reality is the in-house profession does need to change that narrative, because it's not the truth. There's lots of amazing internships and graduate roles into in-house practice. I guess the difference is because they come from lots of different companies, people may not see them, they may not be on LinkedIn, which is where I recommend all law students and graduates keep a really close eye on, because lots of these opportunities are coming up. I think the industry body, I think ILANZ has a role to play in that. I think one thing that always really surprises me is how little academics at law school know about the in-house profession. So when I was at ILANZ, we used to go around the country speaking at the law student sort of career days. And often I'd be talking to the academics, and they'd say, I don't know if there's many people in-house, are there? It's probably only about 5% of the profession. And I used to say to them at the time, well, it's probably closer to 25%. And are you aware that as an academic employed by a university, you actually qualify as an in-house lawyer? And they had very little understanding of the profession or of its size and scale. So, there's probably a job to be done there. I think academics really leaning in to understand the space, because let's face it, 30% of the law students that they are teaching, will potentially go in there. Although actually I take that back. I was talking to the College of Law recently. Only 50% of law students will ever go on to be admitted to the bar. So I think increasingly in New Zealand, law is being seen much more as a foundational degree. You don't actually have to go and practice law, but it's really good grounding in critical thinking and lots of other skills. But of that 50% that do go on to be admitted, 30% of them are likely to end up in-house.
I think it would be really interesting to see what the stat is from if people get admitted but then don't go on to law, because I did that same process where I did a law degree for that foundation, decided that maybe I want to go down the commerce route a bit more, because I also did my Bachelor of Commerce. And then you do your admission because you feel like you've got to tick the box to seal the deal. But then I wonder what that cutoff is of people who don't go from there. Because it's quite a big gap, 50% in the first place. And going back to your business plan, the next one was getting good clients. What makes a good client for Juno Legal?
What makes a good client? I think someone who appreciates and needs and really understands the service that we can provide. We probably about 3 or 4 years ago, we went through a process of working that out and saying, what what does it look like to be someone who's good for us to work with and someone we enjoy working with? And then we looked at a few others who really probably didn't fit that profile, either because they wanted something that we really couldn't deliver. For example, I remember once we were working with a property developer, and he'd been trained as a client by large law firms. He thought our lawyer could work 14 hours a day to get the deal done. And that's just simply not how we work. And it's not the commitment that I make to our team in terms of the way we have to work. Look, and that's not to say that our lawyers don't sometimes flex and make it work if it's going to be helpful to the client and it works for them. But they don't want to do that 5 days a week, for months on end. It's just not part of our offering. So we really needed to take a good look and think, actually, those are clients that don't really understand what we offer and aren't really valuing our lawyers and their best interests. And, I think the first thing I learned, particularly for people starting legal businesses, is really just to start getting in front of clients and helping understand, what are the problems that they're facing and where could I see that we could add some value in helping solve them.
Exactly. The next thing on your business plan was do good work, but I think you've already indicated what Juno does there in terms of the experience that people have to have so you can ensure you have a great service being provided. So I'd love to talk more about the final point on the business plan, which is being happy. And I know that's something that Juno is able to provide the lawyers that are working for it through, for example, flexibility. Can you elaborate more on how the be happy part of your business plan is executed?
Sure. And as you'd imagine, it's highly subjective. So I think, every person has to figure out for themselves what's going to make them happy. I think for us, it's very much about making sure that we're acting in accordance with our values. So they've had a little bit of refresh and cutting back in terms of wordiness, but effectively we've still got the same basic 4 values that we started with: lifting the bar, bringing fresh thinking, being 100% human, and being open and generous. And so every decision that we make, we kind of need to run it through that lens. So, I think where we have an ability to influence that for our team is when, for example, they might have told me that they're really keen to work 32 hours a week and they'd really like to have Fridays off because, maybe the lawyer, he wants to go and spend that time with his young family, or maybe he wants to contribute in his community. And then I'd have a client come in who's adamant that they need a full-time resource. They really need 40 hours a week. My job is to convince that client that actually a senior lawyer working incredibly hard, being extremely productive, and, frankly, not being mired in the bureaucracy that, larger organisations naturally can fall into, means that that person will get delivered in 32 hours a week what it might take someone else 40 hours to do, therefore preserving that lawyer's wish to have that balanced lifestyle. And it's not always perfect and it doesn't always work, but it is really interesting to me how often our clients do say to me they cannot believe the amount of work that one of our lawyers can smash through because they don't need to have quite as much involvement in, internal meetings and some of those other things that perhaps aren't as productive in a legal sense, but are, essential to sort of running a business. So, I think in terms of doing good work, the piece that we're really focusing on at the moment and are really trying to build is not this idea of having 32 or 33 lawyers out there just operating as single units. What we're really trying to build now is a centre of excellence for in-house legal practice. And so we have some peer review mechanisms, we have some knowledge, we use Microsoft Teams exclusively for our internal comms. And so we have lots of threads where people are kind of, obviously anonymously and confidentially, but testing their thinking, helping each other, sharing templates, sharing different approaches. I'm thinking about one recently where someone was saying, this is the situation, would that be better as an agency arrangement or a tripartite contract? And so, when you've got 33 of the brightest in-house lawyers in the country, kind of all bringing their skills to bear, I think what we're creating is actually getting quite exciting. And it's that idea of in-house being a specialist discipline. It's not people who sort of wanted to be private practice lawyers and off-ramped. It's actually people who are in-house lawyers. They understand what organisations want from in-house lawyers. And then we're thinking about how do we deliver services off the back of that.
On that front about collaborating and making a centre for excellence, when you're thinking about confidentiality, how does that work? Could you assume that someone's at one particular company? Like, do people know where people are contracted out to at that time? And can they say, that must be about that message?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. We, obviously if it was going to get too close to being identifiable, it wouldn't work. It is very much and we're quite careful in how we train people. It's very much at a very high level in terms of what would the legal approach here be without giving away any of that surrounding detail. Yeah, all of our people know. I mean, it is New Zealand. Conflicts are always going to arise. What might happen is one of our lawyers might be at a desk, a contract comes across their desk, it has the name of another Juno lawyer on it, not working for that same client, working for the counterparty. So we always get people to pause, we check with both General Counsel, how do they want to proceed, what would they like us to do? So yeah, we manage that quite carefully.
Yeah. And I just want to circle back to your values, because one of them I'd like you to unpack more, which was being 100% human. What does that mean?
I think it comes back to our earlier conversation that, all of us turn up to work with everything that's going on at home, in our heads, in our health, whether it's physical or mental health, what's happening with our families, do we have a good night's sleep? Everything around us impacts on our ability to work. And I think the legal profession perhaps has been guilty in the past of pretending that wasn't true and thinking that everyone could turn up, with 100% A game all of the time. And obviously it's in our interest, and we try very hard to make sure that people are turning up as close to that 100% as they can and being hugely valuable and productive. But it's also recognising that if someone wants to work 20 hours a week, for whatever reason, that's their business why they want to, that they're no less a valuable team member than, one of our lawyers who chooses to work 50 hours a week. Because, we have no unpaid overtime. So if you choose to work 50 hours a week, great, you get paid for 50 hours a week. But you shouldn't be seen as a more valuable member of the team than the person who chooses to work 20 hours a week. For our HQ team, it's understanding how we show up in the office every day, and we do a quick temperature check quite often. Are you feeling red, amber or green? Just so we understand actually how does that dynamic of people working together work best. And, I think in-house legal teams have really leaned into this space. And I know that a lot of the law firms I speak to are really trying to lean into it. But again, it might be lawyers' own perfectionistic tendencies that perhaps, don't let them divulge to their team or to their juniors. Actually, I've had a really hard night. I've been up with a young baby. I'm going to need to, come back to this, or, I just might need to take a moment. And I think we all actually function better when we can have that level of vulnerability.
100%. Thank you so much, Helen. These are all of the questions that I had about your career. I've loved learning about all your experiences and especially about Juno Legal. To finish it off, I have some quick fire questions.
Sure.
Where you just say sentence, word, first thing that comes to your mind.
Mm-hmm.
Kicking it off with, what's the most random or unusual thing you've ever negotiated or worked on as a lawyer?
The most random thing. I'm actually going to steal it from one of my team. Nothing comes to mind in terms of my experience, but we have a saying at Juno, which is that we do everything from the heroic to the humble. When our lawyer goes into a team, and one of our lawyers recently sent me a photo of a portaloo because she was negotiating an agreement to build a new toilet block for, a client who needed that toilet block. And her message was, "Is this humble enough, Helen?" So that's probably the one that comes to mind recently.
Nice. And the place to be in your 20s, London or New Zealand?
Oh, that's impossible to choose. Totally depends where you're at in your life. And, it's a big world out there. London is only one part of it. I know lots of people who head to Australia or they head to the States or to Asia. I think there's something about opening your eyes to the world by living and working overseas. But again, that may not be your journey or may not be, what really excites you. I think the main thing, if you do go, please come home.
I love that. And if you could swap lives with anybody for a day, who would it be and why?
Who would I swap lives with for a day? Honestly, I can't think of it. I'm probably going to say my dog, Zoe.
Nice.
It's such a good life. She gets warm, she gets fed, she gets lots of cuddles. She looks like, honestly, the happiest creature I've ever seen him. So, I'd swap with Zoe.
Nice. And finally, what would be your dream job if you weren't a lawyer?
My dream job? That's a great question. I don't know. That's so sad. Since I was 3, I've wanted to be a lawyer. And it's interesting. People say to me, what's your exit plan? Or, when do you want to retire? I was saying to a client this morning, I love what I do so much. I get to meet these lawyers who perhaps aren't as happy as they could be in what they're doing. And 6 months after joining us, when I catch up with them, for a coffee, they're feeling better, they've got their life back in balance. It's such a privilege to do the job I do. So, I honestly would keep my own job.
I love it. It's quite interesting. I always ask this question, and I think it's like 50-50. We'll get an answer where people say, I love my job. I can't think of anything else. And then the other ones are things you'll never expect, like a travel blogger, or there's actually quite a few travel-related things. So maybe that's a bit of a trend.
Love it.
Well, thank you so much, Helen. If people would like to get in contact with you or find out more about Juno Legal, how can they do that?
Absolutely. Just jump on our website, junolegal.com, or find me on LinkedIn.
Amazing. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Sophie. That was great.